Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. In this video, we're going to be painting a couple of the pet companions from Marvel United. These are the most adorable little guys, and I absolutely just couldn't resist painting them this week. I chose to start with Jeff first. Jeff is a land shark with legs. And then also in this video, I'm going to try and paint Throg as well. Throg is a frog that has the power of Thor, which is a pretty difficult thing to say. Whilst they aren't always the paints that I end up using, I do like to have an idea of the paints I'm going to go into a paint job with. I tend to do a bit of colour dropping on some art software with a picture online in order to try and help me choose my colours. I recommend it. It helps immensely when it comes to trying to choose the right colours and tones that if you want to match the paint job of another model. So to start with on Jeff, I decided to go for the innermost area, which is his mouth. I knew that painting the teeth and the other parts would make it difficult to paint this later on without getting a load of mess on those parts. For the inside of the mouth, I just used red mixed with black to create a dark red, and for the tongue, I just used heavy red, which is an opaque colour from Vallejo. Jeff presents a unique challenge compared to Throg, who will appear in the second half of this video, in that he has much larger, flatter surfaces. And as I began to paint those larger surfaces, I immediately realised I had made a mistake. In some media online, Jeff is shown to have bluish skin, and that's not completely unheard of. You could definitely paint Jeff with a bluish tinge. However, the paints I chose here were far too blue. They were far too saturated and far too blue for what I was going for, at least. And so even though I added them down because I thought, you know what, I'll persevere, see how it goes, see how they dry, and I'll see what it looks like when I've got a full coat of coverage. But in the end, did not like the blue. So fortunately, if you manage to catch this at the base coat stage, you can simply reapply your base coats with a different colour. So that's what I did. I took Anthracite Grey and I took Wolf Grey from Vallejo, Anthracite Grey from AK 3rd Gen, and I added those over the top of the previous base coats I did. These tones were way more grey. They have a bit of blue in them, but definitely more grey. So this would help me get more of that shark look and be less blue overall. This also created a really high level of contrast, which will cause me a bit of trouble in a minute, but I do work it out in the end. Because the two blues I had just chosen, I had originally planned to do with his mouth parts, I now needed to choose new colours for his mouth parts, so I chose Silver Grey and Heavy Blue Grey from Vallejo. As I applied Heavy Blue Grey to the downward facing surfaces around the mouth, you may notice there's a little scratch there. That was me messing around after the primer, trying to clear up some mould lines. Because these miniatures are from a board game, they aren't quite as high quality as a Games Workshop mini, but they're still fun and you can still hide a lot and do a lot with the paint jobs. Similar to his back, on his mouth parts, I made a conscious decision where I wanted highlights and shadows to be and drew a stark and harsh line basically where they were divided. So heavy blue grey and then using the silver grey that I'm currently using to add highlight areas. And you'll see there's basically a split that goes diagonally down the middle of his mouth, shadow to highlight. At this stage, when we're just sketching those highlights and shadows in, it's totally fine to have a really harsh and direct transition like that. I then picked out Jeff's teeth with the silver grey while I had it on the wet palette. And with the harsh, I think using this harsh highlighting and shadowing approach on Marvel United miniatures is really effective because they're so characterful in their sculpts. And so by defining highlights and shadows in really sharp and bright contrasts, you are bringing to life that miniature even more. After we picked out Jeff's teeth, this is what I had. So then I did a bit of recessed line shading, and then it was time to start blending. So I'm only going to include a couple of clips of my first attempt, and I'm going to explain what I did in this first attempt that went wrong, and then I'm going to show you in a second attempt what I did that improved it, and hopefully this will help you to understand the concept behind how I managed to achieve the final paint job on this miniature. Because of the stark difference in contrast, we had a really light blue-grey and a dark blue-grey. I wanted to add a layer in the middle. So I started with a single band that you can see there in the middle of a mix of the two of those together, one to one. And then what I decided to do here was to keep adding different segments, different strips or bands between the different layers to try and soften the transition. The key thing here is that I ended up with 3 very thin transitioning lines, but then the highest highlight and the lowest shadow as well. So I had 5 different paints going across the transition. And this isn't necessarily wrong, pro painters can do this all the time, but the reason it didn't work for me is because when I tried to glaze between the layers were too small. I ended up moving all the glazes in between each other. As I started to glaze my layers, because they were so thin, I just ended up with a bit of a mess. Things didn't work out quite as I wanted them to, and I was losing layers because my glazing was a bit too thick, and yeah, just at my current skill level, this didn't really work out for me. Before I share how I fixed it, in an attempt to help me try and like this more at the time, I did then go and paint the eyes and some of the other details around, and that included painting the base, and I did that in order to try and get the miniature closer to completion, because then I thought the only thing I have to work on then is the blending on the back, and then it'll be done. So it helped me stay motivated. Sometimes when it comes to trying again, you just have to take a reset. So I repainted all of his back where all the blending was with a mix of anthracite grey and wolf grey, until it looked like this. So my second attempt started actually on the wet palette. On the left, you can see the remnants of the previous paints I used with huge jumps in contrast. But in the middle here, you can see that I've mixed a set of 5 new colours that are all very similar and small jumps in contrast from each other, going up from middle anthracite grey wolf grey mix to more anthracite grey and a mix with more wolf grey. The base coat I reapplied to reset the miniature was the paint in the middle of my 5 colour mix, and I then used one jump step higher to sketch a circle shape for the highlight on the front of his nose, and then I filled that in. Then I used one more jump step higher to fill in a slightly smaller part of the nose. And the key thing that was different here is that I had 3 transitioning colours instead of 5 this time. I also left my middle band much thicker, so it would be easier for me to glaze over the lines and create smoother transitions, ensuring there was still some of that middle colour visible between the shadow and the highlight. So then, after a bit more careful glazing between these layers, I was much happier with this second attempt. I think this is just a good lesson that I was being a bit too ambitious the first time with my 5 different layers to glaze between. This transition of just 3 different colours was much easier in the long run. So then I decided to do some specular highlights, which are visible in the reference artwork by Big Child Creatives. And I like that, it makes Jeff look more cute, so I added it to mine as well. And then there were some small details to finish up on Jeff. And one of those things was to add a small bit of dark bluish grey to his eyes, just to give them more depth. I added that as a lower highlight around the bottom curve of his eye. In the official paint job, Jeff also has a small blue ring around his highlight in his eyes. So by doing that, I just added a dot of blue and then re-added a dot of white to the top of that. For the extra cuteness, I also added a second dot of white to the bottom of his eyes. Then it was time to paint Jeff's tongue, and it's an important part of the model because from his front-facing angle, it's a really prominent feature, so I wanted to paint this good. So for this, I jumped straight to ice yellow, which is quite a big jump from the reds below it, but because his tongue is shiny and glistening because of the saliva on it, you can get quite a large amount of contrast, and it will still look good. Then it was time to paint the last thing on Jeff, which is his base. And I used 3 colours for this: bootstrap brown, barbarian skin, and decomposed flesh. I already had the bootstrap brown base coat. Oh god, that's a tongue twister. And then I used my barbarian skin to add the next layer of highlight to most of the areas. I'd say covering about 75 to 80%. And then I did a final layer with decomposed flesh all over that to cover about another 60% of the barbarian skin that we've just applied. I found this was a surprisingly good recipe for brownish type rocky ground, so if you want to take this, if you own those 3 paints, then absolutely go for it. It will hopefully help you as it helped me. Once I'd finished with that, that was Jeff done, but I won't do Jeff's reveal just now. We're going to move on to painting Throg instead, and we'll do Jeff's reveal at the end. So here's another little guy. This guy's even littler, to be honest. He's so tiny. He's a tiny little frog. It's really cute. He's got that amazing hammer that he's lifting up, and I knew this would be a lot of fun. Thankfully, Throg didn't give me anywhere near as much trouble as Jeff because he doesn't have those big open surfaces. He's far more detailed and all tiny parts that I knew I could just pick out with highlights. So that's what we're going to do. First thing we did is we just put down some dark grey on his chest. I'm not going to worry about that too much because most of his chest is in shadow and it's sort of hidden in the center of the model. But then it was time to apply a green base coat all over the skin. So I added heavy green from Vallejo all over. Then I knew he was going to have gold leg parts, so I used Sahara Yellow from the AK 3rd Gen, gold non-metallic metal set to lay down a base coat on those. Following that, I needed a dark red colour, so I used the dark red that I'd used on Jeff's inside of his mouth, and I used that for the handle base coat on the hammer. For his cape on the back, I applied a heavy red base coat, which is a opaque colour from Vallejo, and I just added that all over the cape. Then finally, I added a layer of graphite over all of the metal parts. This is from the non-metallic metal set that AK do for steel colours. I really like those metal sets. They help me focus on the technique, not the colours I'm choosing. For his base now, I'm adding a dark green mixed with dark grey, so I think it was charcoal and heavy green. That gave me a greenish grey base coat for all of the rocks. And with a tiny bit of black on the eyes, this was all of the base coats laid down on Throg. My next step was to use hull red, which is also part of that non-metallic gold set that AK do, to the recessed areas of the legs. There were just a few horizontal lines I filled in basically to create some depth. Then any mess I made with that shadow tone, I came back in with the Sahara yellow and did a bit of a touch up on that, and then I started increasing up through sand yellow and then ice yellow as highlights to highlight all of the gold parts. Then it was time to paint some green, and this is a very important part of the model, I think. It's a big focal point, so I really wanted to do this well. So I grabbed Scorpy Green and I began to highlight upward facing areas, leaving anything downward facing or a deep recess as heavy green. This is once again quite a large jump in contrast, and it creates a big punchy look on the model, which for a small detailed miniature like this is a really good way to make everything stand out. To add a highlight to the cape, I just added Scarlet Blood, which is one of my favourite reds from Vallejo because it's so saturated and bright. That does mean it doesn't cover all that well, but it's still worth it after a couple of layers. I only added this to the top of the folds, and you can see me doing that on the back of the cape here. On the silver metal parts, I moved up from the graphite base coat to a silver grey colour. I didn't follow the official artwork for this because I thought that highlighting would be a little bit more complicated, so I went for a more simple highlighting where the light was just straight on, which meant everything that was cylindrical, like the middle of the helmet, would just have a highlight straight up the middle. The exception to this is the hammer. Honestly, I'm still not exactly sure why the hammer has this pattern of highlighting. I just copied the artwork from the official paint job. I have no idea why the reflections would look like this, but they seem to do it in the artwork and it seems to work, so I tried to emulate the same kind of thing on my hammer as well. And with those highlights down, this is what things were looking like at this stage. I very briefly highlighted the handle of the hammer and I just added in tan to that red and black mix that I used before to get a brighter colour. Going back to the metals, the contrast jump between silver grey and graphite is quite big, so I did a mix 1-to-1, and then I added that to the sides of the silver grey highlights to try and smooth the transition. For shadows on the hammer, I added a tiny bit of anthracite grey into the graphite paint and then used that to go around some of the back and sides to add some shadow. And I also made sure to add some of that shadow on the helmet parts as well, and his tiny little bit of shoulder. So at this point the miniature was certainly getting there, getting close to where I wanted it to be. We still have a few more steps to do before we're done. And the first of those is to highlight the skin even further. And for that, I used Rainforest from the Army Painter. It's a really vibrant, saturated light green, and it would be a great step of jump on top of that Scorpy green we used earlier. When I applied this, I applied it over the top of the Scorpy green parts, but covering less area than those and only about maybe 60%. And this highlight really helped Throg start to look alive. I then highlighted the cape with Angelic Red from Army Painter. I like this red for highlighting because it's not too orangey, but it is significantly brighter than something like the Scarlet Red I used before. Throg has absolutely huge eyes, so I added some highlights to them, and I used Moon Yellow from Vallejo and then Ice Yellow from AK 3rd Gen. Similar to Jeff, I then highlighted Throg's eyes with 2 dots of white, one bigger one at the top and one smaller dot at the bottom. This would make him look cute. Well, more cute. He's already really cute. And then because it's a focal point, I highlighted the skin one last time with Afterglow from Army Painter. It's an extremely light green, and it's really good for that final highlight on any kind of yellowish, vibrant green. And I only added this to a really small part of the skin, just on the edges. It was almost an edge highlight at this point. And then the final thing to do on Throg was to paint his base, and I did this in a very similar scratchy highlighty way to how I did Jeff's base, but with slightly different colours. For this, I used 2 AK 3rd Gen colours. I used green grey and grey green. Can't remember in which order, but the darker one first and then the lighter one above that. Oh, and one tiny thing I did do just because I really liked it on the official artwork is I glazed a vibrant blue really lightly over the bottom of the hammer, just to give it that lightning feel. And then he was done. So here he is. This week I've changed up my background for a black background just to see what that would be like. But Throg's looking really, really good, and I'm really happy with how he turned out. Lots of detail, so it was lots of fun to pick those bits out with highlights, and now he just looks fantastic. So then let's have a look at Jeff, as we said earlier, and here's Jeff in all of his glory. Jeff is also looking fantastic, and I think where I did that rework of those gradients, he looks a lot smoother now, and I'm way happier with how he turned out in the end. I think he's going to be a fantastic addition to my collection, and it'll be a lot of fun to play on the tabletop. I also just couldn't resist showing the 2 characters together side by side because they're bros. And as always, I want to say a massive thank you to you if you've watched my video, and if you like what I'm doing, please support me with all the buttons below. I hope you'll join me for another video next week, and I'm going to go get started working on that right now.